Walking in the footsteps is not the expression I'm looking for. I'm sitting, as it were, on the bottom prints of Thomas Cromwell, who, as local legend tells us, sat on this very spot on that fateful Christmas Eve 1539 and watched Hailes Abbey burn. That is why this place is known as Cromwell's seat. But did it really burn? What is Hailes Abbey? What is its story? And what has all of that got to do with the blood of Christ? Let's go down there and find out. The year is 1242. A storm is raging in the Atlantic Ocean, and caught in it is a fleet of ships. On board one of them is Richard of Cornwall, younger brother of the King of England. In London, Henry III has been on the throne for 26 years by that time, son of troublesome King John, him of the Magna Carta. Henry was only 9 years old when he succeeded to the throne. Just shows how you had to grow up quickly as a king back then. But back to that storm. Richard of Cornwall was back from the Barons' Crusade, where, mostly through diplomacy, he succeeded in reopening the routes for pilgrims to Jerusalem and the Holy Land. He made a vow that if he survives the storm,
he's going to build a new abbey for the worship of God. He survives. His ship reaches safety on the Scilly Isles of Cornwall, and he is true to his word. His brother, the king, grants him yet another gift of land here in Hailes in Gloucestershire, and by putting his immense wealth to best use, he has an entire abbey built, including a magnificent cathedral, at the cost of some £6,600. Building began in 1246, and after just 5 years, Hailes was consecrated in 1251 and populated with 20 monks from Beaulieu Abbey in Hampshire, a daughter house of Citeaux in France. Finishing such a project in just 5 years seems almost beyond belief today, and it would have seemed even faster back in the 13th century. It was an amazing achievement. Richard poached 20 monks and 10 lay brothers from Beaulieu Abbey in Hampshire, where, as the record shows, they were sorely missed. If you look at the plans of Hailes and Beaulieu, which, let me admit it right here, is locally pronounced Bewley, and put them on top of each other, you realize that it wasn't only the monks that were imported from there. The whole abbey is nearly an exact copy. The concept of Cistercian worship back then was that the monks, mostly from aristocratic background and well-educated, did the praying, and the lay brothers did the working, not unlike modern concepts of society.
So how about the blood of Christ? Here's one story, perhaps the most plausible. Richard of Cornwall was not only the brother of the king, he was also, through his marriages and his general wealth, a recognized leader throughout Europe. In 1257 he succeeded to the title King of the Romans. That was considered a prerequisite to becoming the Holy Roman Emperor. That he never became because of power struggles between the Pope and other leaders of Europe. But in 1257, when he was crowned King of the Romans in Aachen in Germany, he brought his young son Edmund with him. There Edmund became curious about an object he saw, a crystal vial with a liquid in it, protected in a box with locks around it and silver decorations. He was told that that is part of the blood shed by Jesus Christ on the cross. Edmund managed to convince his hosts to part with some of the blood, and he brought it with him back to England. In 1270 he presented it as a gift to Hailes Abbey, which was founded by his father. And there it became an incredibly important magnet for pilgrims throughout the next centuries.
The relic was brought to Hailes in a ceremony of great pomp on Holyrood Day, that is the 14th of September 1270. Richard, and later his son and heir Edmund, decided they wanted a grander setting for the relic and had the eastern end of the church remodelled into what is known as a chevet. It would have looked a bit like the grand old church at Cluny, which we had looked at into the video about Tintern. It would have been magnificent, but today all that is left is the imprint on the ground. The best likeness we know of today is the eastern end of Westminster Abbey, minus the Lady Chapel, which we believe was designed by the same architect commissioned by Henry III. If you go there, and let me say right here that you should, the first thing you wonder about is the overall amount of destruction compared to, say, Tintern Abbey not too far from here. The explanation is that it was done systematically, and, to answer that earlier question, Hailes never burned. At its dissolution in 1539 it was peacefully handed over by the monks, who were sent off with good pensions, and then it was taken apart with an aim to maximise profit for the king's purposes. When all the easy-to-sell treasures were carried off to London and the 150 tons of lead off the church roofs was melted down into ingots, the remaining structure was sold to one Robert Acton, whose trade was the dismantling of religious buildings. He went about the job with the energy of a man who wants to make a profit. All the dressed stone could be sold to people constructing a new manor house. So, consequently, some great buildings in this region actually owe their magnificence to the generosity of the 13th century Richard, Earl of Cornwall. Little remains now of that amazing church, and a lot of what we regard as established knowledge today is really what we have deducted from excavations going back many decades, but a lot dating from the 1970s. Judging from bits of an effigy and the coat of armour on tiles found just north of the high altar, we believe that here is the burial place of Richard, Earl of Cornwall. He was buried here next to his second wife Sancha, mother of Edmund, him of the blood of Christ. The location is very close to the final resting place of his first son Henry, who was murdered by his own cousins as revenge for the beheading of their father at the Battle of Evesham. It is actually the murder of his firstborn son and heir that is thought to have caused Richard's demise by way of a massive stroke in 1272. So he never saw the completion of the beautiful eastern chevet expansion of the church, designed to host the relic of the blood of Christ. Looking west and southwards, we find the location of the grave of John and Joanne Huddleston. John was the constable of Sudeley Castle in the late 15th century. We know that she is there from excavations in the 1920s that revealed a female skeleton. He, having predeceased her by 7 years, is probably buried under her. Both skeletons are still in place here. Joanne still has an active role today. She is the Abbey's resident ghost. The cloister is one of the largest in England, with more than 40 metres along one side. It looks as if, at the time of construction, there was the expectation for a much larger community of monks than eventually settled here. The middle space we can imagine as a mixture of herb, vegetable and fruit garden. It must have been very fetching in its day. East of the centre of the cloister was the chapter house. All we can say about it today is that it was surprisingly small, given the size of the cloister and, say, the refectory. One of the finest bosses now on display in the museum here is thought to have come from the vaulted ceiling just above where we now stand. Here the monks gathered once every day to have a chapter from the rules of St. Benedict read to them, hence the name Chapter House. This was the one room in the abbey where the monks, who were otherwise supposed to be mostly silent, could talk about any subject, including matters of the outside world. The only other place where the monks were allowed to talk was the parlour, here only about matters of abbey business. Over here we see some interesting marks on the stone, one mason's mark up here. Every mason used to put his own unique mark on every stone he cut and dressed, to keep track of what he was owed payment for. When used in the walls, the stone would have usually been put in with the mark to the back, which would have also brought the more carefully dressed surface to the front. For some reason, this one here was put in the wrong way round. Over here we see some builder's marks. The bottom line is, still today, perfectly horizontal. The angled lines are thought to have pointed up to where something was supposed to happen, perhaps a beam placed or an arch. One of the most interesting features is the culvert we see here, which still runs all the way through the abbey grounds from a bit east of here, in a southern arch, and out on the western side of the church where it still ends in a little pond. It was fed with water from an artificial lake, the dammed valley stream, that is still there today. That water was used to fill the fish ponds and to wash away sewage. Another function was flood prevention. That is why it is so deep, up to 3 meters. And that bit still works. Even the worst floods of today quickly drain away through this, still functioning 700-year-old sewer. If we step through the back of what remains of a huge fireplace, we come to the warming room. Here a fire was constantly kept burning from All Saints' Day, that is the 1st of November, right through to Good Friday. This was the only place where the monks could warm up in the cold season, and that for brief periods only. The laver is where the monks washed their hands before entering the refectory. Some of what we see here is an early 20th century attempt at restoration, but the general picture is still correct. Entering the refectory from the cloisters, walking southwards, we would have seen benches on the sides to our left and right, with tables in front of them. The monks were sitting around the edges of the room facing towards the centre. The high table for the abbot and other senior monks was at the back facing north. To our right, on the western wall, would have been a raised pulpit where one monk was reading passages from the Bible at mealtimes. There was only one meal a day, usually late morning. Their basic diet was vegetarian, a thick vegetable soup with a pound of coarse bread washed down with mugs of ale. The ale bit may sound a bit frivolous today, but ale is made with boiled water and then stored with some alcohol in it, so basically is a safe drink. Even children had it back in the day. Now, feast days were an exception. They could then have eggs, fish, cheese, poultry, wine, and spiced dried fruit. That may sound fairly reasonable and modest, today's feast days being basically Christmas, Easter, and perhaps Whitsun. But back then they were celebrating every event in the Christian calendar. Some say that there were only about 40 days in the year that were not feast days, so perhaps they were eating much better than it sounds today. Some evidence for this is that their main illnesses were recorded to have been type 2 diabetes and gout.
Behind me is the location of the Old Infirmary. When I asked if excavations had been done there, I was told no, amongst other reasons because it's next to the 14th century plague burial ground. And you don't open a plague burial ground, not without a lot of protective clothing and precautions. You see, some of the pathogens are believed to still be active. Quite a scary thought.
Let me qualify that a bit. Had what we now call the plague been caused exclusively by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the prime suspect, there's almost zero chance for any of those having survived on their own even a single year, let alone centuries. I have found one recent research paper where the bacterium has survived some 4 weeks in soil. In air and sunlight it dies within an hour. That's why archaeologists actually do examine old plague pits without any protective gear, as, for example, when London's Crossrail was built. However, it is now disputed whether all outbreaks were caused by that bacterium. Anthrax spores, one other candidate, can actually survive for very long periods. Also, more recent research suggests that Yersinia pestis can survive for extended periods by being hosted, so to speak, by microorganisms such as amoebae. So perhaps, all in all, better be safe than sorry. Actually, if you look at the LiDAR image of Hailes Abbey with a bit of a trained eye, the terrain evidence of the infirmary does stick out. It is an intriguing thought what you might find there if you did decide to excavate. Below what was originally the lay brothers' dormitory was the cellarage, the home of a particular monk called the cellarer, whose task was to make and look after beer, wine and possibly mead for the abbey, a task that would have involved some rigorous constant quality control. The old drains in this place contain a curious detail, a reused coffin. Judging by the small size, it would have been originally the burial of an important youth, but here it was reused as part of a drains arrangement into the abbey's main culvert. The place was bought by the noble Tracy family of nearby Toddington. The Tracy family has one famous ancestor, one William Tracy, who was one of the 4 brutes who chopped up Thomas Becket in Canterbury back in 1170. Here we are looking at the remaining 3 arches of the abbey's cloisters that were incorporated into the Tracy mansion. We can still see where the wrought iron supports must have been and the slots holding the stained glass window panes. We don't know for sure, but they probably used this place more like a hunting lodge than a permanent residence. By the time they renovated and moved in here, the basic structure was already some 400 years old and possibly just too difficult to adapt to modern tastes. In the 18th century, the Tracy family left Hailes for good and settled at nearby Toddington, some 2 miles northwest of here. Thomas Charles Tracy salvaged some of the window pieces and brought them to the hall with him. There they survived the next century, and in 1903 they were returned to Hailes. They are now part of the incredibly beautiful and interesting east window of Hailes Church. We are going to have a look at that later.
What happened to the blood of Christ in the end? Stephen Sagar, the last abbot of Hailes, was no fool. He had seen the writing on the wall. As early as 1531, he started having good relations with Thomas Cromwell, to no avail. In 1538, he had to allow a commission from London onto the abbey premises to start a thorough investigation into the nature of the relic. All what we read about duck's blood periodically being replenished is probably politically motivated mumbo-jumbo. What we know is that the relic was declared a fake and transported off to London. There its traces vanish. The blood relic enters the historic record officially at the point where it is transported to Hailes Abbey by Edmund and his entourage. What happened before, we cannot be sure. We've got the story of it being picked up at the Emperor's court in Aachen or possibly somewhere else in Germany. There is no record of it at the court of the Holy Emperor. That doesn't mean it wasn't there.
Might there be a way to learn more about the origin of the relic that so suddenly appears in the record with Edmund's discovery in 1257? A few weeks later, I made my way to Aachen in what is now Germany and visited the cathedral with Charlemagne's old throne, his remains and the cathedral treasure chamber. It was the only place I could think about where there might be a chance to pick up that 1200-year-old trail. I struck gold. In the treasure chamber, I not only found on display the old sceptre and coats of arms chest of our friend Richard of Cornwall, but also some interesting information. A nice lady, as I understood a volunteer tasked with watching over the security of all those amazing historic artifacts, turned out to be a hobby historian and gave me the crucial hint. The blood relic has indeed a history in the Roman Empire, going back much further than the 13th century. In fact, I found some record in my own library, in the 1749 printed History of the Popes by Archibald Bower, back then Councillor of the Inquisition. Back in the year 803, Charlemagne received news that a piece of sponge or soil had been rediscovered in the North Italian city of Mantua, which allegedly was steeped in the blood of Jesus Christ. Pope Leo III immediately travelled to Mantua and was able to confirm the authenticity of the find. According to local legend, it had been hidden after originally being brought there by the Roman soldier Longinus, the very man who had pierced Jesus' side with his spear to confirm his death. Being hit by spurts of blood from the wound shocked him into becoming one of the earliest missionaries. Here we have our connection with Aachen and the court of Charlemagne. It is almost certain that Charlemagne would have insisted on keeping a sample of that relic with him. Indeed, there are records of his successor, Emperor Henry III, having possession of a sample as late as 1055. And here's the thing. Whilst all that really proves is that the forgery of the relic, if that is what it was, goes back as far as the 9th century, the plausibility of what we learn the further we dig just leaves us with a small realistic chance that the relic worshipped by pilgrims at Hailes was indeed a sample of Jesus of Nazareth's blood, taken at the day of his crucifixion, which was documented by the Romans around the year 31 AD. Whatever your choice of faith, if any, that thought might just raise the odd goosebump on your back.
It exits the historic record in the year 1538 when it is transported to London, denounced as a fake and allegedly destroyed. No specific record of the destruction of the relic has ever been found. And I wonder, all those priests and bishops by and large were religious people. Everybody was back then. Yes, you could get into trouble with your king if you were too much attached to such things. But would a priest, would a bishop destroy a relic if there is a chance that it is genuine? I don't think so. It would have ended up in the Tower of London, and who knows, maybe somewhere in a cabinet in an old wooden chest which has been long locked. It still waits to be rediscovered. A visit to Hailes Abbey would not be complete without seeing lovely little Hailes Church as well. It predates the Abbey by at least 100 years, and it's still around 500 years after the dissolution. When exactly it was built we do not know. Records of Winchcombe Abbey tell us that it was built during the reign of King Stephen, him of the anarchy, and also of the tenure of Simon of Worcester as a bishop. That puts it somewhere between the years 1135 and 1150. Inside we've got a lovely collection of fantastic wall paintings from the 14th century and some bits and bobs from the Abbey after its dissolution. Let's go and have a look. There is yet one more story about the blood of Christ, a local legend, not written down anywhere. What the commissioners of London examined was really duck blood, or it was really honey coloured with saffron. That's because they were looking at a fake. The monks of Hailes Abbey knew what was coming, and in 1538 they hid the original relic and replaced it with a copy. That was what was taken to London and destroyed. The original is still in some hiding place not too far from here.